Okay, so let's start. So welcome to the hardware security session. So the first talk is going to be by Jonathan, and he's going to talk about FSLH.
All right. Yeah, thanks for introducing me. So I want to talk about FSLH, or Flexible Mechanized Speculative Load Hardening, quite a mouthful, which is a Spectre mitigation that I developed together with Roberto, Blanco, Léon, Ducruet, Sebastian, Harwig, and Cătălin Hriţcu at the MPI-SP in Bochum. Is there anything? Okay. Right. So first thing we should start with, why FSLH? Why another Spectre mitigation? Well, the first thing to say is Spectre attacks have been around for a while, but they're kind of still a threat. There's like no mitigation that has completely fixed it. And in part, that's because existing mitigations often have like complementary strengths and weaknesses. So let's look at two, for example. We might pick Selective SLH by Shiva Kumar et al., which offers sparse protections at very low overhead, which sounds nice, except it's only for cryptographic code, and you might also want to protect something else. Or you might look at Ultimate SLH, which is exhaustive, which means it has very high overhead, but it is able to protect arbitrary programs. You can just throw it at everything. So we looked at those two, and we decided to do something in the middle, which we call Flexible SLH, and it's able to offer sparse protections for all programs. And so we published this at CSF last year. The other thing we wanted to tackle is that existing mitigations, if they have security proof, they rely on manual security proofs on paper. And so we provide the first machine check proofs actually for Selective, Ultimate, and Flexible SLH in some 4,300 lines of Rocq. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page with Spectre, here's the standard Spectre example. We have a small code snippet and an extract of our memory at the top, where we have a public array with 4 elements, and then afterwards in memory we have a secret, and our code performs a bounce check. Now, on real hardware, as most of you have probably heard before, an attacker can observe control flow and memory accesses. So here, our attacker can observe the outcome of this condition. It can observe the index I, and it can observe the index j, which here depends on the array at I. Now, this should all be fine if the array is public. Unfortunately, well, we're reasoning about Spectre here, so we have speculative execution, which means instead of waiting for this branch condition, if you have something that's out of bounds, our CPU unfortunately takes a guess, executes this code anyway, here loads our secret into J, and then therefore leaks the secret to the attacker. So clearly this is something we need to prevent. So let's look at some of the previous work. We'll start with Selective SLH, which, as I mentioned before, applies to cryptographic code, and therefore has the advantage of being able to work in a CCT type system for cryptographic constant time. So here, we label or we type all our variables and arrays as either public or secret. And then the type system actually does not allow us to use secret values in positions where they could leak. So this is standard practice in cryptography. And so now Selective SLH leverages this. Firstly, it's a speculative load hardening mitigation. So it keeps track of whether we are currently speculating or not by storing this in a special register, here the register B. And it does so by updating this register with constant time conditionals with the same condition as the branches, so that even if the branch is predicted, the value of this flag will not be predicted. And then they can leverage this to mask the values that they read into public variables. So if the flag is set, if you realized you're somehow on the wrong path, you're somehow speculating, you just mask this to 0 in this case. Now, the selective part is that they don't need to do this for secret variables, because the type system already guarantees that nothing can leak from secret variables. So you could put whatever you want into a secret variable. So therefore, this yields a very efficient mitigation for them with only minimal masking. But it's only for a limited class of programs, only code which is in this CT type system. So on the other hand, we can look at Ultimate SLH, where they don't have a type system. They just mask everything. Importantly, that means they have to mask indices, not just the loaded values, because the indices can leak. And they have to also mask branch conditions, which is what other work doesn't always do. Importantly, they also mask a lot of other stuff, but we don't model that. So their mitigation applies to all programs, but also has very high overhead. I think in their benchmarks 150%. So that's bad. So we want to find a middle ground between those two. So what we do is we reintroduce the security levels, but we now obtain them with a static information flow analysis. Importantly, that means we don't restrict the use of secrets and can therefore accept all programs. This also means we have to sort of combine the two masking approaches. So if the index is secret, we have to mask the index. If the index is public, we get away with masking only the value. And of course, we may also have to mask branch conditions, but only if those are secret. So that's sort of how we developed our mitigation. Now, the next question you should probably have is, if we want to prove that this mitigation is secure, but we do it for arbitrary code, well, our source program could be completely insecure. So what do we do? So actually, we take a look at our compiled program at the bottom, the one with our mitigation applied. And we take two executions that are run in speculative execution in two different initial states here. And this produces some observations here, O1 and O2. And if those observations are different, if we find any leakage in our compiled program, then we prove that this same leakage was already present in the source without any speculative execution. So it's not introduced by speculative execution. It's not a Spectre attack. In practice, we prove the counter positive, and we call this relative security. So just some quick information before we continue. In our attack model, attackers observe control flow, as in branch conditions, and indices of memory accesses. So this is a standard constant time leakage model. And our attacker actually has direct control over the branch predictor in our case. So we just allow the attacker to supply directives that fully determine how we execute. We go a bit further. The attacker can even choose the locations of out-of-bounds accesses, because our language still has arrays, and we don't model a memory layout. And in terms of the speculative execution itself, we actually go with a forward-only semantics, as introduced by Bart et al. So that means we do not model rollbacks. We do not track like rollback states. Once the attacker causes us to mis-speculate, we cannot go back to sequential execution. This may sound a bit weird, but they already proved, and we also have mechanized proofs, that the results actually do carry over to normal semantics with rollbacks, and it makes it a lot easier. Right. So again, here's the diagram we want to prove. We have our equal observations at the top. We want to prove that they are still equal at the bottom after we apply our mitigation. So our mitigation actually comes in two parts. We first apply some information flow analysis. Then we apply the masking based on it. So in between here, we do a neat trick, and we introduce a third level. We call that the ideal semantics. And we give the semantics speculative execution, but obviously a highly idealized model. In practice, that means that we do the masking in the semantics instead of as a code transformation. And we apply it in the exact same way that our code transformation would also do, which means it matches the behavior of the compiled program. It produces the exact same leakage, and we can prove this with just a backwards compiler correctness proof. We don't need to reason about both executions at once here. Then we also instrument that with dynamic information flow tracking, so that we can then prove relative security for this ideal semantics at the top. However, that also requires something much more important, which our annotations have to actually be correct at runtime. Unfortunately, we produce these annotations with a static analysis on the initial program. And during execution, we refine our states, we refine our program. And so this doesn't really preserve. If we were to rerun the analysis, we would now have a more precise outcome. So this is unsuitable for the proof. So we actually introduce a well-labeledness predicate, which, if you want, you can see as typing for the annotations. So our predicate says that an annotated program is labeled correctly to go from some initial labeling, which we provide, to some final labeling. This mechanism then allows us to prove a lot of things you would otherwise do about typing. So for one, our information flow analysis produces well-labeled programs. So we supply the initial labeling here, and it gives us an annotated program and a new labeling. And then this annotated program has correct labels to go from our initial labeling to the final labeling that it produced. The more important thing is this property is actually preserved by ideal execution with respect to the dynamic tracking. So if our program was well labeled for this labeling and the dynamic tracking after one step updates to this new labeling, the remaining program is well labeled in the new labeling. So with that, we can start assembling our proof. This now comes in 3 parts. One is for once we start to misspeculate in our ideal execution, we can prove what we call unwinding. And this just says that without even reasoning about the source program anymore, the observations here will always be equal. That's just due to 2 things. Everything that we label as secret will be masked. So this is just fully deterministic. And everything that is labeled as public, due to well-labeledness, is actually public. And therefore, according to our dynamic tracking, it will be equal in both executions. And therefore, the leakage will have to be equal in both executions. Then, for the part before we start misspeculating, we just look at our source program, and we see that there's a one-to-one correspondence here. We haven't transformed the program. We have only added annotations. And so the behavior before misspeculating is exactly the same. And then once we assemble that, we get relative security at the ideal level, which we then compose with our backwards compiler correctness proof to get the full proof of relative security. So to sum up, we have a secure mitigation in that it has fully mechanized security proofs in Rocq. It's general in that it accepts all programs with our analysis. And it's efficient insofar as it only inserts protections where needed. Now, we choose a middle ground between 2 prior works. It turns out we're actually just a generalization of both of those works. So we actually coincide with Selective SLH on programs that are CCT. And we coincide with Ultimate SLH if you just label everything as secret. That means that we obtain mechanized proofs for those mitigations as corollaries of our proofs. Right. There is some future work left to do, always. In particular, the big point here is that we don't actually have a practical implementation, and therefore no real-world evaluation of FSLH. Partly that is because we still have some quite big questions, such as when in an actual compiler can you even perform such an analysis so that the results hold for future passes, and also where can you potentially insert your mitigations so that it doesn't get destroyed by later passes. The other thing is we would like to eventually investigate other LLVM SLH implementations, or potentially other compilers as well. Now, obviously, if you look at a real compiler, that is far too complex for mechanized proofs, and we're investigating property-based testing as a compromise approach. And finally, this is only a mitigation for Spectre v1. So we're also looking at other Spectre variants. For example, there's prediction of indirect branch targets and of return addresses. And we currently have some ongoing work on the indirect branch targets. All right. With that, I thank you all for listening. And I'm very happy to take some questions.
So are there any questions? Well, if not, I have a question about, you mentioned you have a mechanized proof that rollbacks are not necessary. Can you comment a bit on this?
I mean, I can comment in general. Do you have anything specifically you'd want to know?
Yeah. Why are they not necessary, and how do you prove this?
So, yeah, I'll just go with why we don't need to model rollbacks. The idea is that if you have an execution that exhibits some leakage, and this execution is something with a lot of rollbacks in between, we only care about the first instance where our observations differ between the 2 executions. The moment we find a difference, we have leakage. And so at every branch, we can just ask ourselves, is the leakage in the misspeculated part, or is it later? And if it's in the part that gets rolled back, then we don't care about what happened after the rollback, so we don't need the rollback. And if it's after the rollback, we don't care about what happens before the rollback. That part wasn't relevant to actually exhibit the leak. Yeah, this was already proved by Bart et al., and we've mechanized this for semantics as well.
Thank you. I have a very naive question. I've heard of so many SLH variants that it's hard to keep track of. Here you see that you have a relationship, you have a generalization of two of them. How much variety do you think there are in SLH variants? At which point can we just relate them, or this is just a whole variety of non-comparable passes?
So I guess I haven't really thought about that too much before. So for one, I'm mostly familiar with the original SLH as first implemented in LLVM, the two I presented here, and strong SLH as well, which sort of was a predecessor of the ultimate SLH. I guess you could certainly conceptually systematize that a bit. Like there's just questions of like tracking misspeculation is the same across all of them, and then they really only differ in what instructions they actually mask. For loads where they mask, like do you mask the address or do you mask the value? And then with selective and flexible SLH, there's the question of do you mask always or do you have some mechanism to restrict that? Yeah.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
And maybe the next speaker can start getting ready.
So you said for the future work you want to do this for other Spectre variants. I was thinking about the same thing, like SLH for other Spectre variants, and the hard thing is basically to create the mask, right? So for indirect branch targets, I had an idea where you could like mask by, I mean, you know which address you jump to, right? If you always have the indirect branches jumping on the same register, you could take that register to make the mask out of. I'm not sure if this is like something, I was wondering, like for return addresses, I think it's not that easy. So I was wondering if you have another approach or a similar one.
So I guess I can, is my mic still on? Yes. Okay. The first thing to say, like with these indirect branch targets and return addresses, is you already need to rely on some extra hardware features to restrict that at all, right? So you have the issue of you always need to update your mask after you perform the jump. Like once you're actually in the target, before you don't know where you will be jumping. And the downside is if you cannot restrict at all where you can end up, you have no way of actually putting that check anywhere because you can jump at arbitrary instructions and even misaligned. Like there might not even be an original instruction there. So you rely on hardware features such as Intel CET. And that then automatically also gives you some protections for return addresses as well. So I think we'd be in line with other related work there to say we mostly trust the hardware protections for return addresses. And so for indirect branch targets, it's just that the hardware protections are too coarse. They just give us that we jump to some defined entry point, but not where. But also, you're fully correct about if you have some register that you always jump to, you can directly use this information to track that.
I think it's time to move on to the next talk.